Last time we were covering Abraham and his journey. If you'll remember, he traveled from Ur up to Haran, and then from Haran down into Canaan. And then throughout his lifetime, he did some traveling around Canaan and around the area down to Egypt during famine and back up. And then we read about how he had sent his servant off back to Haran, basically, Padam Haran, in this area up here. I think last time I mentioned that he had gone all the way back to Ur, but that wasn't the case. They just went back to Haran. So it was only half the journey that they had to take when they went back to find Rebekah. 750 miles, not a full 1,500 miles, but still a long travel. So we read how God had promised the land of Canaan to Abraham and his descendants, but the land was far from uninhabited. There were plenty of people living in this area at that time. When it came time for Isaac to be married, we discussed how he sent his servant back to Padan Aram, and that's in Genesis 24. We read that the other name for it is Aram Naharaim, which means Aram of the two rivers. So it's basically between the two rivers here, which is, I think, just a tributary or splitting off of the Euphrates River. So he went to a town where Abraham's brother Nahor had settled, and there he meets Rebekah, who is the daughter of Bethuel, who was the son of Abraham's brother Nahor. So this is all a lot of family genealogy that they go through here. But he was a distant relative. So the servant goes there and he prays to God that he'll find someone from Abraham's family. And of course, the first person he finds is Rebekah, who is part of Abraham's family. So he's super excited about that. Well, Rebekah has a brother, and his name is Laban. Now, this is going to become important a little bit later on when we start talking about Jacob. Laban kind of comes back into the story. So Laban is the brother of Rebekah, and he sees a servant giving her the jewelry and everything, and says, "All right, hey, come stay with us. We want to put you up and let us know what you're here for." And so he explains to him that Abraham sent him to find a wife for Isaac. And both him and Bethuel are just excited about this. They're like, "That's great. He's gone off. He's become very wealthy and rich, and now he wants our daughter as his, for his son." So they were fine with that. So Rebekah mounts up, goes back with his servant back down here. Now we start to talk about Isaac and where he was living at the time. It says in I think it's Genesis 24, verse 62. We read, Isaac had his home in the Negev, which is the region southwest of the Dead Sea between Canaan and Egypt. So it's kind of this area right down here. In fact, I think it shows it a little bit better on this map. This area down here is what they call the Negev. Now, what's interesting about that area, there's a well there called Be'er Lahai Roi, which was actually named that by Hagar. Now, if you remember, Hagar was Sarai's handmaiden that she gave to Abram, and he had relations with her, and she bore Ishmael, his first son. So when that happened, Sarai got really upset with her and said, I can't stand the fact that she's pregnant and I'm not, and she sent her off. When she sent her off into the desert, basically, kind of down this way. And she had the baby with her and thought she was going to die because they didn't have any water. So she laid the baby down under a bush and she kind of went off on her own. She didn't want to be near him when he died. And an angel came to her at that time and said, "Hey, what are you doing? I'm gonna make this child into a mighty nation as well." And at that point, he pointed out that there was a well there for her, and she was able to get water, and then he told her to return to Sarai. And so she named that area Be'er Lahai Roi, which means the well of the living one who sees me. So, I mean, it's a really long name, but she basically is giving, attribution to God and saying that God saw me in my time of distress and he put a well here, to provide for me. All right. So we're told that this Be'er Lahai Roi is somewhere between Kadesh, which is down in here, Kadesh Barnea, and Bered in the Negev. But the precise locations of these have been kind of lost over time. However, the region is sparsely watered. So the well would have been an important place for Isaac because, again, he was a shepherd. He had flocks. So he would have been watering his flocks at any well that he could find in the area. So it says that he was near Be'er Lahai Roi in the Negev, and he was on his way home when the servant came down with Rebekah, and he saw them coming and ran up and welcomed them, and the rest is history. So they were down in this area, basically, near Beersheba, kind of Kadesh Barnea in the Negev. And that's where they kind of settled. All right. So Isaac's half-brother Ishmael and his descendants, they were told, were told that they inhabited the region from Havilah, which is the modern-day Arabian Peninsula, this area here, all the way from basically the Sinai Peninsula all the way up to Ashur, which is up here. And it says that they basically were a nuisance to everybody. Now, if you remember, there was a prophecy that was given to him that he was going to basically be at odds with everyone and everybody would be at odds with him. And that's what ended up happening with most of Ishmael's descendants. And we know that today the Ishmaelite Arabians, this was around 600 AD when Muhammad went into the cave and came out with this revelation that he said he got from the angel Gabriel and started the Islam faith. He claimed that his descendant was Ishmael. So that's where the Muslims come from. So kind of an interesting correlation there. But back to Isaac. He and Rebekah, they end up having twin sons, Esau and Jacob. The famine hits the land, which seems to be kind of a recurring theme in the stories of the patriarchs. It seems like almost every single one of them had a time where there was a famine and they had to go down into Egypt to get food. Abraham had to do it. Isaac did it. Isaac now, as we're talking about, Isaac was actually told by God not to go down to Egypt. So Isaac, in Genesis 26:1, God tells him to remain in the land, even though there's a famine there, and that he will be blessed in doing so. So he does, and it says that he moves up to Gerar, where Abimelech, king of the Philistines, lived. Anybody got a clue as to where that would be today? So that would be Gaza, which is a more familiar term. We've been hearing that a lot in the news over the past couple of years with Israel and Gaza. Well, Gaza is an area right kind of between Israel and the Mediterranean Sea here on the coast. And that area has actually been occupied by the Philistines for a long, long time. And we read about that when Joshua comes in to conquer the Promised Land, that the Philistines are in that area as well. Even during the time of David, there are Philistines in that area also. And so what's interesting about this is today the people who live there in Gaza are called what? Starts with a P. Palestinians. So a similarity between the words Philistine and Palestine being what they call their land, was actually, it was named that by the Romans when the Romans occupied the area as an affront to the Jews, because the Jews caused them so many problems. And we read about that all through the New Testament. But they named the area Palestine instead of Israel, because it was Israel when they occupied it. It was Judea and Israel. So they renamed it Palestine after the Philistines. that live there. But in the Palestinian language, they actually don't have a p sound that they use in their language. They have a soft p. It's an F sound. So when they talk about themselves today, even, they don't call themselves Palestinians. They call themselves Philistinians. So it's an interesting correlation. They're basically the same people who have been there for all this time. And it says that Isaac went up there because it's still in Canaan. He didn't leave Canaan because that was the area that God had promised to Abraham. Now, his inclination was to come down here to Egypt because Egypt had this amazing delta down here. The Nile River would just water all of this land coming out of the Nile, because the Nile is one of those few rivers in the world that flows from south to north. So it flows from down here up, and it becomes a kind of a delta tributary down here that's very well watered. So they're always growing lots of food down in that area. So every time that there was a famine, people would move from here and go down into Egypt, and there would be plenty of water and plenty of food down there. So instead of doing that, it says that he stays up here. He just moves kind of closer to the coast over here in Gaza instead of being down here in Kadesh Barnea, Beersheba area. Well, while he's there, God blesses him, and he starts producing more than the people who are in the land around him. And they start to get jealous. They start to get really jealous of him. And so they start filling in the wells that he's dug with dirt. Now, I don't know how you can justify in your mind, in the middle of a famine, filling in somebody else's wells that are productive with dirt instead of just being like, hey, can we get some of your water? Can we have part of that too? But they were so upset with him that they just started filling in his wells with water. And so Abimelech eventually tells him, hey, pack up and leave. You're causing too much trouble in our land. You're becoming too mighty. You've got, all of these material possessions and wealth, and we're concerned that you're going to, take over. So he tells them to kind of get out. So he leaves, and he kind of comes a little bit further south, and he digs a well there, and he finds water. And then all the shepherds around there start complaining, saying, that's our water. You can't have that. And so he calls it, I can't remember if I wrote down what he calls it, but it basically means an argument. So he names the well, there was an argument here. So he gets up and he leaves, and he comes a little bit further south again. And he digs another well. Well, same thing happens. More shepherds come, they say, hey, that's our well. This is our water. And so apparently he names that one after an argument, or what does it say? A conflict, basically. And so he goes even further down, closer down into this area here, and he digs a third well, and this time nobody bothers him about it. So I guess by that point they'd all gotten all the water that they needed or something. So he digs that one, and he calls it Rehoboth, which means open space. And he's saying God's finally given us a space of our own that we can expand and kind of, set up our tents here and settle. So from there he moves down to Beersheba, which is right here. So he kind of worked his way from Gaza down here to Beersheba. And that's not really a huge distance. It's probably less than 50 miles. But, it's enough space that he's not super close to where Abimelech is, and nobody's complaining about him anymore. So he settles right there, and he builds an altar to the Lord. Now, Jacob and Esau were kind of at odds with each other. I don't know if you remember the story. Esau, he's starving to death. Jacob's making this amazing scrumptious stew, and Esau comes in from the field and he says, brother, give me some stew. I'm going to die. And he's like, well, sell me your birthright. And he's like, hey, what good is my birthright to me? I'm about to die. You can have it. And so he makes the worst deal in history, and he gives up his birthright for a bowl of soup. So, if they had Let's Make a Deal back then, I don't think he would have done very well at that show. We're given a few details also about Esau that kind of make the next part of the story make a little bit more sense. In Genesis 26 and verse 34, we read that Esau takes 2 wives of the Hittites. Now, the Hittites were people who were already living in this land. So they were Canaanites. So he takes 2 wives of the Hittites. And in verse 35, I love this verse. It says simply that Esau's wives made life miserable for Isaac and Rebekah. So everybody's got those people in their family that are just, they just make your life miserable. And apparently these 2 wives of Esau were just that. Now, Jacob had not married. He was still unmarried, but they were twins. So they were the same age. So Esau's already married. He's got 2 wives. They're a nightmare. And Jacob doesn't have any wives. So Jacob's kind of the favorite of his mother's kids, especially at this point because he doesn't have 2 wives that are driving his mother insane. So she comes up with this plan to trick Isaac into giving the firstborn blessing to Jacob, even though Jacob came out after Esau. He was technically the younger child, even though they were twins. And so they come up with a scheme. It works. Esau blesses Jacob, and Isaac blesses Jacob. When Esau finds out about it, he's absolutely livid. He's not only given up his birthright now for a bowl of soup, but now he's lost his blessing as the firstborn son as well. And so he makes a plan to basically kill his brother once daddy's out of the way. And Rebekah catches wind of this, and so she tells Jacob, you got to get out of here. I want you to go back up north to Haran. I want you to stay with my brother Laban. He's going to take care of you. And so she goes to Isaac and she tells him, and this is just the cherry on top. In verse 46 of Genesis 27, she says to him, I am sick and tired of these local Hittite women. I would rather die than see Jacob marry one of them. So she pretty much convinces Isaac to say, okay, all right, Jacob, I want you to go back to, Haran and get a wife from there. Don't marry somebody local because it's going to drive your mother insane. So Isaac gives his blessing to Jacob. He sends him off to Haran to marry one of Laban's daughters. Little did he know, and little did Jacob know, he'd actually end up marrying both of Laban's daughters. As Laban turns out to be a pretty shrewd man, he convinces Jacob to work for him for 7 years to marry Rachel, and instead of giving him Rachel, he gives him Leah. And so he says, all right, well, I'll give you Rachel too, but then you got to work another 7 years for me. So he ends up working 14 years for Laban just so that he can marry Rachel, who he wanted to marry in the first place. And as we know, out of that union come the 12 tribes of Israel. So Jacob takes off. It says that he leaves there and he comes up, and there's a place here called Luz, which on most of your maps, you're going to see it marked as Bethel, because that's what he ended up naming it after he had this vision there. But this is where he lays down and he gets this vision of a stairway to heaven. And he sees the angels coming down and going up on it. And God speaks to him and he reaffirms his promise to him that he is going to inherit this land. This was his inheritance now because he got the blessing from Isaac. And so this was the blessing that he had given to Abraham, and he's saying, look, I want you to come back here because right now I know you're running for your life because you're afraid that Esau is going to kill you, but God had to make him want to come back. And so I think that was God's whole purpose in showing him this vision at this point as he's leaving the promised land. He wants him to see this vision, and he sees it and he says, surely this is, obviously this is the gates of heaven, where the angels are coming up and down. This is God's promised land. And so God shows him the vision to remind him of his promise that he's made to Abraham, that he would also, inherit this land. And he kind of uses this two-pronged approach with Jacob to get him back down here. So not only does he show him, this is going to be your land, and I'm giving you this vision, and I'm reaffirming my covenant with you, but then he also gives him Laban as a father-in-law. And Laban is just, he's the worst. He tricks him into working for him for 14 years, And then he starts doing all this stuff where he's saying, well, you can keep all the goats that are speckled, but I want all the goats that are solid. And so then it only produces speckled. And so he's like, well, now I want all the speckled ones, but you can have all the solid ones. So he keeps changing terms on Jacob. And basically it drives Jacob nuts. And he gets to the point where he's sick and tired of it. And he picks up and he just leaves while Laban's out in the field. He takes all of his family and they just book it back for the promised land. So we're told in Genesis 31 and verse 18, it says that Jacob took his wives and children and they left Padan Aram, which is up here, for Canaan, where his father Isaac lived. Now this part kind of blew my mind because we were talking about how far the distances are here. So we're given this situation here where Rachel, she steals Laban's household idols as they leave. And when he finds out that they're gone and that they took the idols with them, he takes off in hot pursuit of them. Well, it says that Jacob crosses the Euphrates, which is right here. So we're right up here. He crosses the Euphrates and he heads for the hill country of Gilead. Now, Gilead is this area right here between the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea. So this area right here in the middle of Canaan. So he's coming from here all the way down to here. Now, according to our little thing here, that's well over 200 miles. I mean, that's probably closer to 400 miles there. And it says that in Genesis 31:22, 3 days later, Laban's told that Jacob has taken off with his idols and all of his family. So he heads off in pursuit of them. And it says they catch up to him 7 days later in the hill country of Gilead. So it took Laban and his men about 7 days to travel from Haran to Gilead. It's like 400 miles in 7 days. So I mean, they were pretty well booking it. But I imagine, he was also kind of booking it because he only had a 3-day lead on him. And he was able to make it all the way from up here down to Gilead. So that kind of blew my conception of how long it would take to get down there out of the water. So I guess you could do it in about a week if you really were booking it. So he catches up to him and they, kind of make an agreement and say, hey, you were good to us. We want to be good to you. We want to leave you on good terms. We didn't want to leave you on bad terms. They kind of make a covenant there. And Shechem kind of in this area right around here. And so then Laban and his men, they go back and he continues on with his wives. They go down to Bethel, which is where he had the vision of the stairway to heaven, right around Luz. And it says that he settles there. But then his 12 sons, as we remember, they were farmers, they were shepherds, they had flocks, and they would flock anywhere from between Bethel area up to what says Dothan, which is up here. So that was about, a 30-mile stretch or so, 30 or 40 miles, where they would have their flocks just roaming the countryside. And it's up in Dothan where they turn on Joseph, which is the youngest, or Joseph was the favorite of his father's sons. And remember, he made him a coat of many colors and everything. And so they get upset with Joseph and they throw him in a pit and they make this plan to kill him. And then I think it's Reuben says, no, let's not do that. We'll sell him. There's some Midianite traders that are coming down this way. Now, if you remember, the Midianites, I think, they were also one of the tribes that came out of the sons of Abraham. Abraham, after he had Isaac, he actually took another wife named Keturah. And it says that he had several children with Keturah, and one of those was named Midian. So the Midianites were kind of an offshoot of Abraham. But he told them basically to leave and kind of go out this way because Isaac, his son, was going to inherit the promised land area. So all the rest of his kids kind of got pushed out. So they moved kind of out into this area. But the Midianites, they were traders, and they would kind of travel up and down between this area up here and Egypt. And it's on one of those trade routes that they see them coming down, and they're like, hey, let's sell them to these Midianites, and they'll take them down into Egypt, and then we'll be rid of Joseph. So the Ishmaelites, or the Midianites, who were also Ishmaelites, it says they were coming down with a caravan of gum, balm, and aromatic resin from Gilead, headed down into Egypt. So they take them, they go down into Egypt with Joseph, and they sell him to Potiphar. Potiphar is an officer of Pharaoh and the captain of the palace guard. And God blesses Joseph, and he gives him favor with Potiphar, but eventually he ends up also attracting the attention of Potiphar's wife. If y'all remember that story, she tries to get him to sleep with her, and he runs away, and when he does, she grabs his tunic, and he runs out of the house naked. And so she starts screaming that he was trying to assault her. He gets thrown into prison over this matter. And while he's in prison, he gets favor with the prison guards and with some of the prisoners who are in there, most notably Pharaoh's cupbearer and his baker. And they have these dreams, and he interprets these dreams for them while they're in prison. Well, when they get out, Pharaoh has this dream, and he can't get any of his magicians to tell him what it means. And so his cupbearer is like, hey, I know a guy. He's in your prison right now, and he can interpret this dream for you. He interpreted my dream, and it came true. So they bring Joseph out. Joseph interprets the dream for Pharaoh and basically tells him, God's telling you that you're going to have 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine. So during that 7 years of plenty, you need to store up all the grain and everything in these storehouses, because you're going to have these 7 years where the famine's going to be really bad after that. And so Pharaoh's just like blown away by this. And he basically elevates Joseph to second in command in all of Egypt and gives him control over everything. So he goes full doomsday prepper. He starts building these silos, and they start filling them with all the grain and everything. And sure enough, 7 years roll around, and the famine starts to strike. And it's during that time that everybody then starts coming back down to Egypt again, like they always do. They run out of food up here, so they come down to Egypt. And he's got food ready to go. He's got these silos just packed with grain. And so people start saying, well, we'll sell you all of our goods. And then they sell them all their goods, and they don't have anything left. And they're like, well, we'll sell you our lands. And he's like, all right, so we'll sell them their lands. So you actually see a large influx of people, not just Jacob and his sons, but all the inhabitants of this area. They were coming down there to buy food, and they didn't have anything left to buy it with, so they started indenturing themselves as servants to Pharaoh. So that's an interesting point. When you start to read it in Exodus, it talks about when Israel came out of Egypt. It says a foreign rabble went with them, because they weren't the only ones who were imprisoned in Egypt at the time. There was also these other nations, people who had come down, who had been imprisoned as well alongside of them. So there's actually a large group of people, they call them the foreign rabble, that came out of Egypt with them. And I think a lot of those ended up being indentured into slavery during this time of that famine as well. So there's a little bit of history here, but there's about several hundred years. Oh, no, I'm sorry, I'm skipping over a part here. So Jacob's brothers come down out of Canaan into Egypt looking for food, and there's this whole drama that plays out, and it's actually a really wonderful story if you read through it. How he basically tells them to come back with their youngest brother Benjamin, because Benjamin was his only direct brother through Rachel, and the rest of them were all half brothers. And they bring Benjamin back, and he kind of stages it so that it makes it look like Benjamin was stealing his cup that he uses. And so they're going to throw him in prison if they don't bring his father back with them. So they do that to trick the father, Jacob, into coming back. And so he gets his whole family to come down to Egypt, and then he kind of springs the surprise and is like, "Hey, it's me, Joseph." And none of them recognized him, of course, at this point, because it had been years and years and years that had passed, and now he was, in full Egyptian garb and everything. So it's a really neat story. It's a wonderful story, but basically, because of his status in Egypt at the time, he is basically second in charge right below Pharaoh. And so Pharaoh's like, "Hey, your family is my family. Su casa, mi casa. We're all good here. I want you guys to move in next door." And there's this area over here to the east of the Nile River area called Goshen. And Goshen was a pretty fertile area, a lot of pasture land there. And I didn't get the chance to do the research into this, but apparently there was some issue where the Egyptians did not like shepherds for whatever reason. They didn't like people who had flocks. So they wouldn't even sit down and eat with them, which is kind of interesting because we see that dynamic kind of play out in the New Testament where the Jews won't touch anything having to do with the Gentile. They won't sit down and eat with the Gentile. And yet here the Egyptians are doing the exact same thing to them. So I don't know if it's just a turnabout, but they didn't want to have anything to do with shepherds or keeping flocks or anything like that. And so they said, "Hey, you guys stay over here. Just keep your cattle over here on the side of the fence and don't come over on ours. But you can have this whole area here." And so Jacob's whole family moves down into Goshen and they settle there in Egypt. And they're there for several hundred years. And the Bible kind of picks up the story in Exodus where they're already in Egypt for 400 years or so and they start to be oppressed and God speaks to Moses and tells him to bring them out. Well, during that time, I did a little bit of research on who was the Pharaoh of Egypt during that period of time. And it would have been about the 12th dynasty of Egypt, which is right around 1875 to 1850 BC. Around 1730 to 1710 BC, there's these Asiatic people that kind of come into Egypt and they sort of take over, and they're called the Hyksos. Now, they're not Egyptians, but they take over Egypt and they kind of take over the dynasty, essentially. And these people, a lot of historians think, were the ones where it says that they didn't know who Jacob or who Joseph was, because Joseph held pretty high status among Egyptians. And he stayed that way for quite some time. But then eventually it says a new king rose to power who didn't know Joseph or what he'd done for Egypt. And so they started to just look at the Hebrews over here, these shepherds and the people who are keeping the flocks and stuff, as they didn't like them, and they were starting to get numerous and they were starting to be worried that they were going to take over. And so they started kind of indenturing them and making them their slaves and oppressing them. So the Hyksos, a lot of people believe, were the ones who kind of started to do that. And they stayed in power, I think, all the way up until about 1570 BC, when Moses comes onto the scene in 1526. So up until about 50 years before Moses comes onto the scene, at that point they were kicked back out of Egypt eventually by the Egyptians, who then took back over. But at that point, Joseph was pretty much forgotten by even the Egyptians. So nobody really knew who Joseph was. They just knew the Hebrews were a nuisance and they were enslaved. All right. So it's believed that Pharaoh, during the time of Moses' infancy, was Amenhotep I. He was the one who especially oppressed the Hebrews, the one that sent out the notice that they were going to kill all the Hebrew children, all the Hebrew males that were born. And so that's why his mother put him in the reed basket and set him in the Nile, so he wouldn't be killed. So that was Tutmos I. So Tutmos I reigned from 1526, which is when Moses comes on the scene, until about 1512 BC. Tutmos II succeeds Tutmos I. He reigned 1512 to 1504, followed by Tutmos III, who reigned from 1504 to 1450 BC. And it's likely it was Thutmose III who sought Moses' life after he killed a prominent Egyptian at the age of about 40. That part of the story where he sees an Egyptian beating one of the Hebrew slaves and he kills the Egyptian. And then it's found out, and that's what kind of forces Moses to leave Egypt and go off into the wilderness. So he flees up across the Sinai Peninsula, and he actually comes up out into, where is it? It says he went to Midian, which would have been on the east side of the Sinai Peninsula. So that's like over in this area. I'm sorry, on the east side of the Sinai. So yeah, right here, Midian. So he actually left Egypt, came across the Sinai Peninsula down into Midian. Now, if you remember, I said Midian was one of Abraham's descendants. So he would have still been, or a lot of the Midianites at that point still worshiped God because that's what Abraham did. And it's there that he meets a character by the name of Reuel, or Jethro, who it says is a priest of Midian. So he's this character he meets there, and he ends up giving his daughter Zipporah to Moses as a wife. And a lot of people believe that that's where Moses kind of learned about God, because he wouldn't have learned about God in Egypt. You know, in Egypt, he was raised in Pharaoh's household. So he would have been brought up learning about the gods of the Egyptians. Even the Hebrews at that point, I don't know how many of the Hebrews actually really still followed the worship of God. Although it does say they cried out to him. How that looked, I don't know. You know, we're not really given a lot of details, but we do know that they were enslaved, and so they were building a lot of the temples. They were, you know, doing a lot of the stuff for the Egyptians, and they would have been steeped in that culture that they were surrounded by it. And that was a very polytheistic culture, whereas, you know, Abraham and his descendants were a monotheistic group. They worshiped just God. So in Midian, he meets Jethro, marries Zipporah, and stays with him in the wilderness. Now it says that during that time, he becomes a shepherd, and he's off with his sheep up here in the Sinai Peninsula. So on the other side of this, I guess the Red Sea, where it comes up and it splits, the Sinai, he's over here, and he goes over to Mount Sinai, and that's where he sees the burning bush. And that's where God first speaks to him and tells him that he wants him to go and to deliver Israel out of Egypt and out of slavery. So that's as far as I'm going to go with this part of it for today. I think next time we're going to focus on the Exodus and the wandering through the wilderness and the taking of the Promised Land by Joshua. But any questions with regard to, I know it's a lot. It's a lot of place names, but it's a lot of, you know, people just kind of moving from one area to another along this, what they call the Fertile Crescent at that time. And so you're going to hear a lot of these place names kind of regurgitated throughout the Bible as you're reading through. But I think it's important that we talk about them as we're being introduced to them so that we kind of understand the importance of those places. Like, for instance, Bethel is the place where the Ark of the Covenant would reside. And that was the same spot where he saw the ladder coming down out of heaven with the angels going up and down on it. So there's, you know, I think it's interesting when you start to look at some of these place names and you see how different events happen throughout the Bible in certain areas. And it's just fascinating to put it all together, and it kind of gives us a bigger picture. So, any questions, comments? It doesn't say who he killed. It just says that it was an Egyptian. Apparently, it was a fairly prominent Egyptian, somebody who was going to be missed. And we don't really know. It just, the way that it's laid out in Genesis, it says that he saw him abusing one of the Hebrews and he killed him. And apparently that Hebrew that was there and witnessed it must have gone off and told somebody else, because it says he came back another day and there were two Hebrews fighting and he was trying to break them up, and the one Hebrew said to him, "Hey, you going to kill me like you did that Egyptian?" And then he knew that he had been found out. So that's what kind of prompted him to, get out of Egypt and run off into the wilderness. So, no, we don't know who it was that he killed, unfortunately. But good question. Yeah. All right. Well, I think we'll close with a prayer so we can get you guys out of here before you all get snowed in. Don't need anybody else slipping on any ice heading home. So, Father, we thank you for this chance to come together this evening to study your word, to get a little deeper understanding into some of the places that we read about in your word and their significance and the importance behind them, Father. If they were important to you, important enough to write down, Father, then they should be important to us to look into and to understand what they mean. And so, Father, we just pray that you would give us that understanding, that you would help us to take that and apply it in our own studies so that we can have a bigger picture, Father, of what you're trying to show us. Lord, we ask for your blessing over everybody as we head home tonight. We ask for your protection as we travel. Keep the roads clear and help us all to stay on our feet and not slip. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.